Good morning, happy Monday. This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. I'm Tom McKenzie in London. These are the stories that set your agenda. Heading to DC, Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelenskiy and European leaders look to pin down those US security guarantees as they meet with Donald Trump, with the White House expected to focus on territorial concessions. Asian stocks move higher as investors look out for a deal in Washington, with this week's speech by Fed Chair Jay Powell also in focus. Plus, China's top envoy travels to New Delhi as Asia's leading economies seek to ease tensions in the wake of Trump's tariff onslaught. So the focus shifting when it comes to geopolitics from Alaska to Washington, D.C., where the meeting will take place later today between the U.S. president, the president of Ukraine, plus his key European backers as well, including the presidents of France, the prime minister here in the U.K. and the German chancellor, as well as the head of NATO. So we'll unpack that story for you as well. That is key in terms of how the markets respond. Oil prices remain in focus. The lack of detail over the weekend in terms of that meeting between Presidents Trump and Putin remains, of course, a key focus as well in terms of getting some clarity, possibly, in terms of what exactly was discussed. European futures, then, currently on the front foot by 0.2%. With the context, you've had 2 straight weeks of gains for European and US stocks, and you're looking to move higher again in the session today. FTSE 100 futures looking to add 22 points here in the UK. S&P futures then, little modest gain there of 0.1%. Again, after 2 straight weeks of gains. The focus, of course, will be on Jay Powell as well towards the end of the week in terms of that speech in Jackson Hole. Nasdaq 100 futures looking to add 46 points with technology again in focus. You've got a big earnings story unfolding out of Asia, particularly in China through this week. Looking to add 0.2% on the Nasdaq 100 futures. Let's flip the board and have a look cross asset then. Modest gains coming through for US Treasuries as we look ahead to that speech by Jay Powell. 4.30 right now on the US benchmark 10-year. That's a move lower by 1 basis point, as you can see. Euro dollar at 117. A little bit of strength coming through for the single currency. Brent at $65 a barrel, largely unchanged. You didn't see a lot of volatility, in fact, around oil, but no additional sanctions, of course, being announced by President Trump as yet. Gold, the yellow metal, currently adding about 0.6% at 3,351 per troy ounce. Let's cross over to Asia right now. There's a big focus in terms of Chinese equities performing very well at decade highs, potentially closing at decade highs over in Shanghai. Min Min Lo standing by in Hong Kong with a check on those Asian markets.
Hey, Tom. Yes, the Shanghai Comp is already at a decade high right now if it closed at that level. But here we are seeing the Asia-Pacific index up about 0.4%, broadly on the upside here as we look ahead to that Trump-Zelensky meeting. We are seeing the Kospi, though, off by about 1.2%, led by losses in the chip sector, following through after those declines among their U.S. peers, but the Nikkei up by about 1% or so. We're keeping an eye on the yen because as we look ahead to this potential ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia, the BOJ Governor Ueda is saying that maybe we could see the yen hitting above 148. Can we flip the board, please? So we're trading at about 147 now. Ueda is saying maybe we could go above 148 if we get that ceasefire because of the fading of this demand for the safe haven currency. And at the same time, of course, the domestic geopolitical uncertainty as well, potentially making it harder to keep actively buying the yen. But on the flip side, our own MLife strategist, Mark Cranfield, is saying that maybe the yen could emerge the winner after Jackson Hole, again, depending on what Jay Powell and Ueda says at the meeting, especially after the verbal intervention from Scott Bassett last week saying that the BOJ is behind the curve. Of course, we have the CPI data from Japan coming out on Friday, expected to show inflation being sticky above 3%. That's going to make it harder to ignore the price pressure there. And so Mark Cranfield is saying it's too early to rule out a live September meeting. But bottom of your screens, you can see that the the JGB yields are ticking up as well because we're looking ahead to those 20-year bond auctions tomorrow. And flip the board, we're looking at China. As you said, Tom, a really interesting picture that is emerging here because we continue to see bond yields ticking up. We are now at a 4-month high for bond yields, but you see this, the Shanghai Comp really on this upward trajectory since April of this year. It's above the 10-year high right now. Depending on where we close, we could see it headed above that 10-year high by the end of the day. And it's really interesting, right? Despite the weak data we got last week, whether it's the housing data, the credit data, or the activity data, it looks like investors are shrugging off all that negative sentiment, perhaps over a speculation that maybe this means there could be more stimulus from China, but also because of the abundant liquidity, right? Southbound flows really hitting record highs on Friday, and it looks like retail investors in particular are trying to find more returns among the equity markets because of that very low interest rate environment in China. Tom?
Okay. Shanghai Comp and Chinese equities close to the highest levels since August of 2015. Minimum low in Hong Kong with a check on those Asian markets. Minimum, thank you. Now, Donald Trump will host Volodymyr Zelenskiy, as we've been discussing, and European allies at the White House today. The plan is to set out terms for a potential peace deal that President Trump discussed with President Putin last week in Alaska. The US expected to focus on territorial concessions demanded by Russia. US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff says Washington would be able to offer security guarantees to Kyiv.
We agreed to robust security guarantees that I would describe as game-changing. We didn't think that we were anywhere close to agreeing to Article 5 protection from the United States, in legislative enshrinement within the Russian Federation, not to go after any other territory when the peace deal is codified.
Well, Bloomberg's Oliver Crook joins me now from Brussels with the reactions. We look ahead, of course, those European leaders and Zelensky heading to Washington. Before we get there, Ollie, the focus then from the US, certainly Witkoff, as we heard, on this potential security guarantee, possibly from the US and its European allies, in terms of a win coming through with the conversations between the Presidents Trump and Putin. At least that's how it's been framed by Witkoff. We know, though, that Russia is going to be seeking those territorial concessions. What do you think really stands out? What are the key takeaways as we lead up to this crucial meeting later today in Washington?
Yeah, Tom, I mean, there's a lot to unpack from that meeting on Friday, but there's also even more we don't still know about it. What I think is interesting is, of course, the symbolism for everybody here in Brussels, where you still have a Ukrainian flag flying behind me because Zelensky was here yesterday meeting with Ursula von der Leyen, was the red carpet for President Putin on American soil, sharing a podium with Donald Trump. That, obviously, from the sort of headline perspective, is the thing that has caught most of the concern for the European allies here. I think, though, the most significant thing that we've learned over the last 48 hours since that meeting is exactly what Witkoff was talking about in that interview that he did over the weekend, which was basically saying for the first time very explicitly that the United States is willing to give some of those security guarantees to Ukraine in the event of a peace deal going forward. What do those security guarantees actually look like? That is still an open question. But what he is intimating effectively is Article 5 kinds of protections for Ukraine under NATO without them joining NATO. So this is effectively a sort of NATO-light arrangement in the event of a further attack by the Russians into Ukraine, that the United States would come to the support of Ukraine. Now, if that is in fact the case, two things to make there. The first point is that that is a very significant step forward. That is something that the United States has refused to explicitly say going forward. But the real question is, Tom, why does that require Russian consent? That is sort of backstop of Article 5 to NATO is something that is unilaterally imposed by NATO allies for their own allies. That is not something that requires Russian consent. It is, of course, helpful for the Russians to say, we understand this, and we're going to put this into sort of Russian legislation enshrinement, which, of course, what that's actually worth is another question. But for the United States, that is something that they could have willingly, up until this point, said that they're willing to give Ukraine without those discussions with Putin. So that side of it is a little bit unclear, though it is a significant development.
Right, the idea that you need sign-off from Moscow for those security guarantees that you can effectively put in place should you be sitting in, of course, Washington and inside the White House. Ollie, when it comes to the response from Zelensky, you talked about the fact that, of course, he was on the ground in Brussels meeting with Ursula von der Leyen and others. Let's take a listen to what he had to say, particularly around the sanctions challenge for Russia, at least the Ukrainian perspective. Let's listen in to the Ukrainian president.
Since the territorial issue is so important, it should be discussed only by the leaders of Ukraine and Russia at the Trilateral, Ukraine, United States, Russia. So far, Russia gives no sign that Trilateral will happen, and if Russia refuses, then new sanctions must follow.
So, Ollie, I guess the key question is territorial changes, territorial concessions, maybe from both sides, but also the willingness or not of this president, President Trump, actually to enact those sanctions that he's threatened.
Absolutely. But even the tone that you had over the weekend with Trump and Putin on Friday, they were talking about potential for economic cooperation going into the future. So, of course, sanctions are one question, but that's sort of the different from the perspective that we heard from those two leaders over the last few days. What we will say on the question of the territory, this is a very, very thorny question, as you know, Tom. Any sort of territorial concessions made by Ukraine are unlikely to be sort of legally recognized by Ukraine. I don't know, it would be sort of a de facto potential acknowledgement that these are regions that are no longer under Ukrainian control without a sort of legal backing for it. But again, we know from the very beginning when Trump came in to be president of the United States and his view on Ukraine that he was going to take what generously people would call a much more pragmatic approach, what the Europeans would call as a much less principled approach in terms of resolving the situation in Ukraine. The reality is that Russia holds a large proportion, a large majority of some of these regions, and that is something that we know from the beginning that Trump was willing to put on the table. The question then comes to the European side. Are they going to be willing to play ball on sanctions, on potential sanction relief going into the future? Let's also not lose sight of the fact that for the Europeans, as far as they're concerned, they have paid trillions of dollars in terms of the sanctions because of the sort of gas, the natural, the resources that are no longer flowing in. It has come at great personal cost to the Europeans, so they're going to be loath to sort of roll that back without any sort of concrete resolution to this crisis. And I have to say that despite the fact that there has been some significant steps forward, it is hard to see still today how that gets resolved in its totality.
OK, hence the importance of the meeting, of course, later today in Washington at the White House between those European leaders, the president of Ukraine, of course, and President Trump. All those details that need to be ironed out. Still, Oliver Crook on the ground for us in Brussels with that analysis. Ollie, thank you. The other key focus for investors, of course, in terms of monetary policy is Jackson Hole, the symposium taking place later this week. For more in terms of the market reaction to this, let's bring in Bloomberg's Valerie Teitel. In fact, at least how the markets are gearing up for a potential consequential, it's always going to be consequential, isn't it, a speech from the Fed chair at Jackson Hole, but at a time when there is really still this debate about whether or not September is fully locked and loaded for this Federal Reserve, Val.
Yeah, will he or won't he use this Jackson Hole platform to make a big signal to the market? In recent history, Jerome Powell has really done just that. How could you forget? In 2022, he used this speech to warn that there will be pain for consumers, for businesses from higher interest rates, but that was warranted to tame inflation. And then just last year, he used this platform, Tom, to signal that time has come to adjust policy. That was a big signal that the easing cycle was about to begin. A lot of questions here on whether he will use this platform to change his tune on the labor market after previously characterizing as solid. That was before we got these payroll revisions and that weak payroll data just at the beginning of the month. That will be the key focus for the market. We're now sitting around 85% chance of that September rate cut. Odds have been pared back just slightly, and that was due to Friday's data. We had a double whammy of higher import prices, and then the University of Michigan also showed that inflation expectations, especially long-term inflation expectations, had ticked higher. If you can flip over, I can show you the price action in the 30-year yield. The long end of the bond market really got torched on Friday, especially in Europe, but the U.S. was really leading the charge there. The last 3 days, we've seen around an 8 basis point rise in the long end. This has kind of reignited some worries about inflation. Those import prices ticking up really did just that on Friday. But before we get to Powell's speech on Friday, we do have some U.S. earnings, which might give us a better glimpse of how the U.S. economy is dealing with tariffs. It's all about retailers this week, Tom. Walmart is the big one on Thursday. The market will be very interested to hear on how consumers are faring, given the uncertainty backdrop of tariffs, the economic uncertainty that it implies, and how are their inventories stacking up? Have they raised prices to consumers? Those are the kind of color that the market will be looking for from these earnings this week.
OK, fantastic. Valerie Teitel, thank you very much indeed. Always love watching the data and the details coming out of those major retailers in the US for a clearer gauge on the consumer and the tariff impact. Of course, supply chains in focus as well. Valerie, thank you. Here's what else to think about for the week ahead then. On Wednesday, we're going to get UK inflation data out at a challenging time. Of course, the Bank of England and a lack of a clear path in terms of what next for the BOE. Let's see if inflation gives some clarity to that story. We'll break those numbers for you, of course. And on Thursday, global flash PMIs, so the manufacturing sector and factories globally, how they're adjusting, of course, to the tariff impact. And on Friday, it is the big one in terms of speeches. Jay Powell with that speech at Jackson Hole, Wyoming. You can get a roundup of the stories you need to know to get your day going in today's edition of Daybreak. Terminal subscribers can go to DAYB Go. And there you have him, Jay Powell, front and centre, of course. And then on the homepage in terms of Daybreak, it's the European leaders meeting with Zelensky in Washington with President Trump. Coming up, we're going to find out what is going on in oil markets then as Presidents Trump and Zelensky meet later today. The oil markets, of course, in focus around those additional sanction risks. Peter Navarro telling the FT that India has a role to play in terms of its purchases of Russian oil. The focus there, at least for that trade advisor. Coming up, the details from the oil markets. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. Let's focus in on the oil space right now. Stadium as traders turn their attention to Donald Trump's meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky later today. The Ukrainian leader under pressure, of course, to reach a peace deal with Russia that involves ceding territory. But, of course, there is that threat, and we heard that from Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, on potential additional sanctions that could, again, be targeting parts of the oil space linked to Russia. Let's bring in Bloomberg's Anthony de Paula in terms of how the oil markets are adjusting to what we've been seeing in terms of the diplomacy from the US, Russia, and later today, Ukraine. Anthony, what have the markets been zeroed in on in terms of a potential deal between Ukraine, Russia, and the US?
Yeah, Tom, good morning. Well, the markets seem to be pretty zeroed in on the fact that there's not going to be Russian oil coming out of the market. So we saw oil pretty much stable around the 66, 67 level through last week, as traders really didn't seem to think that there was going to be that additional pressure put on Russia and put on Russian oil exports. And we're seeing the same today. So we're down a little bit today as well after that meeting, where we've seen kind of a deadline after deadline pass. And, it's kind of the story of another week, another meeting. We had that initial Friday deadline where if the Russians hadn't complied, hadn't signed a ceasefire, there would be heavy pressure and sanctions. That passed because we went to last Friday's meeting, which didn't come up with a result. Now we're into today's meeting, which looks really like damage control, kind of avoiding a disaster would probably be a success for the Europeans and Zelensky. They don't want to have a repeat of that previous Zelensky visit to the White House. So they'll talk about this deal. But it doesn't look like the market is believing that there's going to be additional pressure on Russia coming out of this. So we've still got that those tariffs on India for buying the Russian oil. You mentioned that op-ed from Trump's former trade czar about trying to put more pressure on them. But we haven't seen the component of pressure on China. And in fact, Trump was saying after that meeting that he would probably hold off on putting sanctions on China. So what we see in the oil market is that when there is sanctions or tariffs put on one country, the oil flows seem to adjust and get to other countries. So we're probably going to see some shift, and we're already seeing it in parts from India, flows of Russian oil from India to Russia. So we're looking at that, and we're going to see how that keeps developing. And that seems to be what's keeping the market stable as it is, because we see those flows continuing, Tom.
Yeah, and that trade advisor to President Trump, Peter Navarro, in an opinion piece for the Financial Times today, talking about India's role in terms of purchases of Russian oil and criticising, again, New Delhi for those purchases. China, as you say, so far, it seems immune to those secondary sanctions, or at least not impacted, not being targeted by the Trump administration. Brent trading at $65 a barrel right now in the session, up 0.1%. Anthony de Paula, thank you very much indeed for the market reaction when it comes to the oil space to these conversations on geopolitics. Anthony, thank you. Coming up, relearning skills and adopting tools in the age of AI. I spoke to the CEO of Swedish unicorn Lovable about what's coming for the jobs market. That interview is next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. Now, a Swedish startup that allows non-coders to build apps and websites has become Europe's latest unicorn. Lovable uses AI to help anyone develop a program within minutes. The firm says its users are now creating more than 100,000 projects a day. CEO and co-founder Anton Osika says Lovable is adding between 8 to 15 million US dollars in annualized recurring revenue a month. Osika spoke to me about the growth outlook, jobs, disruption, and the appeal of Europe over the US.
What we're also seeing is that the price per the same level of intelligence for AI is going down quite rapidly. It has been for the last two years. And as that trend continues, we're getting even better margins on our paying users.
And given what you guys are able to do in terms of the product and some of your competitors as well, in terms of enabling people who don't have those coding skills to code and build all these applications, what does it mean if you're an entry-level coder? How much trouble do you think you're in?
Yeah, I think everyone in the age of AI really have to relearn which tool to use when. And if you are technical and you know how the coding works, you're actually more productive with Lovable. So that we're seeing a lot of technical people loving the tool and then being able to talk more productively to the AI. Anyone can learn how to be productive talking to the AI, but there's an advantage for technical people. I think what we're going to see is that everyone is a developer. Like now, there's been much less than 1% of the world population. Everyone is becoming a developer now, and 99% of the best ideas are from people who don't know how to code. So this is for me a very clear example of AI having a positive impact. More people can start successful businesses without being bottlenecked by not having time or the skill set required to build software.
And you'd recently raised, of course, $200 million, a really big raise, of course, even within the context of what's happening within AI. Do you look to raise again this year? What are your future fundraising plans, Anton?
So it's clear to me that the company is not cash constrained, but might be looking later on or in next year raising from specific partners that we think could really drive the business forward. But again, I don't want us to be distracted by fundraising. We're just going to use this capital to build the best application layer AI team in Europe. And it looks like we're not going to be cash constrained in the coming 12 months.
Okay. Any thoughts about an IPO, or is it too early for that?
It's too early to even think about that for now. We think the flexibility we can operate with now is very productive. But at some point, of course, as we build a generational product and brand, that might be interesting.
Yeah, of course. And look, you're in Stockholm, a city that is producing a lot of pretty phenomenal tech companies, and Klarna is one of them.
Thank
and of course, it's one of your clients. When you think about listing, even it is a further away prospect, Anton, is Europe the place that you would consider, or does it have to be the gravitational pull of the US?
So I'm really betting on Europe, and one of the reasons we're here is to prove that you can build a world-class team and execute better and faster than from the US. I would love to list in Europe, but I haven't looked at any of the details.
Okay. And in terms of when we look at, for example, Google absorbing Windsurf, and earlier on, of course, in this innovation story, Microsoft absorbing Inflection, is that potentially what happens to you and Lovable? Would you be open to that kind of acquisition where the talent is absorbed into one of the mega cap US tech companies, or is that something you would fight against?
That's something I would fight against. I think not.
Good morning. This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. I'm Tom McKenzie in London. These are the stories that set your agenda. Heading to DC, Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelenskiy and European leaders look to pin down US security guarantees as they meet with Donald Trump, with the White House expected to focus on territorial concessions. Asian stocks move higher as investors look out for a deal in Washington, with this week's speech by Fed Chair Jay Powell also in focus. Plus, China's top envoy travels to New Delhi as Asia's leading economies seek to ease tensions in the wake of Trump's tariff onslaught. So, European futures are pushing higher this Monday morning after 2 straight weeks of gains for European and US equities, up 0.2% on the European Stocks 50 futures. FTSE 100 futures here in the UK looking to add 20 points so far at this point. S&P futures pointing higher by 1/10, and Nasdaq 100 futures looking to add 41 points as we lead up to the open. Later today, stateside, of course. Let's flip the board and have a look across asset. Jay Powell with that key speech on Friday. Will he lock in expectations for a September cut, the first one of the year, or will he push back as markets price in about an 85% chance that the Fed goes in September? 4.30 right now on the US benchmark 10-year, yields down 1 basis point, 117 on euro dollar. Oil a little higher at 0.1%, 65, closing in on $66 a barrel. And gold up 0.4, jumping in the session at $3,350 per troy ounce. Now, European leaders will join Volodymyr Zelensky at his high-stakes meeting then with Donald Trump today in Washington. Ukraine's leader is facing growing pressure, of course, from the US to agree to a quick peace deal with Russia. US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff says that could involve Ukraine ceding swathes of Russian-occupied territory.
The fundamental issue, which is some sort of land swap, which is obviously ultimately in the control of the Ukrainians, that could not have been discussed at this meeting. We intend to discuss it on Monday. Hopefully we have some clarity on it, and hopefully that ends up in a peace deal very, very soon.
Let's get back to Bloomberg's Oliver Crook in Brussels, who's been covering this for us and looking ahead to the meetings later today in Washington. Ollie, the territorial issue then, how much room does Zelensky have to adjust around the pressure coming through from Russia and the US, frankly, in terms of some of these potential territorial concessions?
From the very beginning of Trump taking power in the United States, and even in the lead up in the electoral campaign, Trump had made it very clear that he was going to take, what generously some would call a much more pragmatic approach to the wartime realities of basically territory that is occupied by the Russians. And that would mean, in practical terms, effectively conceding certain areas of Ukraine that are mostly monopolized currently by Russian military forces. We should say that the two regions in questions in the Donbass are not entirely held by the Russians, but that is, from what we understand, what the conversation is going to circle around today in the White House between Volodymyr Zelensky, President Trump, and of course Zelensky's massive coalition of European allies who will also be present in that meeting, from Friedrich Merz to Emmanuel Macron, Keir Starmer, Mark Rutte from NATO. Those will all be in the room to have those discussions, because the other side of this discussion, Tom, will also be, and this is I think the most significant thing we've heard out of the White House over the last 48 hours, the security guarantees that the United States is apparently now willing to provide in the sort of ambition of keeping long-term peace within Ukraine. What those security guarantees actually mean would be something like a NATO light, a sort of Article 5 guarantees for the rest of Ukraine after a deal gets struck, in which the United States would come to the military defense, the active military defense of any kind of further infraction on a Ukrainian sovereignty. Again, we should say there's a lot we still don't know. There's a lot about the conversation with Vladimir Putin on Friday that we still do not have details on. But what the conversation in the White House today with all of these leaders is going to center around are basically what the Ukrainians are willing to accept, what the Europeans are willing to provide. For example, Tom, we talk about security guarantees provided by the United States. There's another question here. What are the Europeans willing to provide? We talk about this coalition of the willing led by the UK, France, and Germany, but we've heard from the Germans before that they do not want to commit troops longer term in peacekeeping capacity within Ukraine. So there are a ton of different issues for these leaders to discuss today. Hopefully we begin to get a little bit more light, a little bit more contours in what a sustainable agreement could mean longer term, but that is going to be front and center for all of these leaders descending on Washington, D.C. a little bit later today.
Okay, Bloomberg's Oliver Crook, thank you very much. On the ground for us in Brussels with that preview. Let's get more analysis right now because, of course, Volodymyr Zelensky and European allies are anxious to find out what Donald Trump committed to at his summit with Vladimir Putin. The Ukraine president says unity among allies is vital at this pivotal moment.
It's crucial that Europe is as united now as it was at the very beginning, as it was in 2022, when the full-scale war began. This unity really helps to reach real peace, and it must stay strong. First, we have to stop the killings. Putin has many demands, but we do not know all of them.
OK, let's get more with Oleg Ignatov, senior Russia analyst at International Crisis Group. Oleg, thank you for your time this morning. What will you be watching for in terms of the meetings in Washington later today and what Ukraine and the president may be able to extract from this conversation with President Trump?
Well, Mr. Zelensky is in a very difficult situation right now. He has a very clear but very difficult, from the political point of view, choice. And he has a choice between like a Trump and Putin's peace deal, which is very difficult to implement politically and which will have political and security consequences for him, and to continue with the war, which it seems he can't win. And it's very difficult for Zelensky and for European leaders. And of course, today we will see if he agrees with basic ideas of the basic concepts of this peace deal. Is that if Ukraine agrees to leave Donbas, and it seems that is the core condition right now. So if he, as a commander of chief, can order Ukrainian troops to withdraw from the rest of Donbas and to evacuate, of course, civilian population, or he understands that he needs to continue this war, relying mostly on Europeans and maybe risking even a worse deal in the future. I think this is their dramatism of the moment.
The US putting a lot of weight, it seems, on the security guarantees that they claim the Russian president has conceded to, NATO-like security guarantees. What would viable security guarantees for Ukraine have to look like in practice, Oleg?
The main security guarantees for Ukraine is a strong Ukrainian army. And you know that according to the Putin statements and Russian previous statements, they will try to demand to limit Ukrainians' army capacity, so-called demilitarization. We don't know if the demilitarization is still on the table. If it's out of the table, so I think the strong Ukrainian army, which is supported by European deliveries, by European training, or by American also deliveries and American trainers, it will be the strongest security guarantee which Ukraine can have. And the second security guarantee is, of course, the deployment of Western troops on Ukraine. We know, again, that Russia is against any deployment of NATO troops in Ukraine. So these are two main security guarantees.
It seems that when it comes to the territorial issues, as much as it's about national pride, as much as it's about the legitimacy of those territorial claims, it's also about concerns from Ukraine that they could be leaving a land bank for Russia that could be used as an access point for future conflicts and future invasions. How real is that risk for Ukraine?
It's a very big risk because the rest part of Donbas is the most fortified area. Yes, Ukrainians built this fortified area since 2014. And before the war, there were almost 600,000 of people lived there. And if Ukraine leaves these territories, of course, it will be a big risk for the Kharkiv region, for Dnipropetrovsk region. But I think if Ukraine leaves and the war resumes, Russia's next goals will be, of course, Zaporizhia and the Kherson region. I would remind that Russia declared that it annexed also Kherson and Zaporizhia region. So I think the idea is that for Russia is that Ukraine is against this deal right now. Russia will try to take over the Donetsk region. And after that, it will say that the conditions of the peace is that Ukraine should withdraw from Kherson and from Zaporizhia regions.
Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, of course, in the US, has warned again of potential consequences if Russia does not agree to a deal. How real do you think that threat is from the Secretary of State, given Trump's proximity, it seems, his relatively warm regard for the Russian president?
Well, we see that the US position has changed a lot since January, February. Yes, and I would say that the US position is moving towards Russia's position. And it shows that the United States understands that it has no such a big leverage over Russia. I think that Putin is not afraid of tariffs and sanctions. Putin understands and he makes his decision based on the situation on the front lines. And he believes right now that the situation on the front lines is developing in Russia's favor. And Americans understand from their part that they don't have a leverage which could influence the course of the war or could change the course of the war in Russia's favor. And I think that's the reason why the United States right now is closer to Russia than, for example, to Ukraine and to Europeans. They understand their leverage is not so strong. And this is also part of the story.
Okay. A US policy position or stance that is closer right now to Russia than it is to the Europeans or Ukrainians. At least that is the take from Oleg Ignatov, senior Russia analyst at International Crisis Group. And we'll see if that adjusts or changes on the back of the meetings later today in Washington. Thank you for your insights. Continuing geopolitics, but a different region, and Trump's trade war with China and India, helping to forge stronger ties between the two of the world's most populous countries. Of course, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi is visiting New Delhi today, making his first trip to the country in over 3 years. For more, our government reporter Sudhi Ranjan Sen joins us from New Delhi. And behind the scenes, at least in the last few weeks, there has been this rapprochement, it seems, between Beijing and New Delhi. And it's significant, of course, for the region. And it looks like Trump is a factor in what seem to be thawing bilateral relations between India and China.
Well, Trump is definitely a catalyst in this, and he's kind of, added more urgency to both India, on India's side, and from the Chinese side, perhaps, to kind of normalize the relationship. However, India and China kind of started moving towards normalizing, towards bringing down the temper of the freight relationship since last year. And the first on-ground indication of that was both sides pulled back troops from the disputed parts of the border, which was then subsequently followed up by a meeting between President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Narendra Modi, their first in 7 years. That kind of set the ball rolling, and that happens a couple of weeks prior to President Trump winning, and in November, and then of course taking over office in January. Having said that, yes, from the ground what we understand is that Trump is definitely a catalyst. The erratic trade policies, the penalties that are supposed to be on India for buying Russian oil are all acting as a trigger for both sides to kind of normalize relationship, relook at how they can continue to do business, if not at terms prior to 2020 when the border clash happened, but how do they keep going the working relationship?
So given that context then, Sudhi, what is expected from the meeting today between Wang Yi and his Indian counterpart?
Well, I mean, today the Chinese, foreign minister is going to meet the Indian foreign minister, Subramaniam Jaishankar, and tomorrow he meets National Security Advisor Ajit Doval on the border issue. From both, we are not expecting major announcements, but what we are expecting is that these two meetings are likely to set the stage and the tone for the meeting between the two leaders, that is Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping, later this month. And lots of things are being discussed, as my colleagues and I have been reporting. Things like direct flights between India and China, ease of visas, because after the border clash in 2020 June, visas were something that both sides cut down on. And of course, there was then the pandemic that was there. That those curves have not been removed. So easing of those, curbs, restarting of direct flight between the two countries, which is a major demand of the Chinese, are things that we can expect to come out of. These meetings and then being declared or announced later on in the month.
OK, with the potential economic, of course, and market impact, should those changes come to pass, of course. Our government reporter, Sudhi Ranjan Sen, thank you for that important update in terms of that meeting later today and, of course, what to watch for as well as China and India try to repair the damage to that relationship that has occurred, of course, since that border clash last year. Coming up, hundreds of thousands of Israelis, meanwhile, have rallied demanding an end to the war in Gaza. We're going to be bringing you the latest from the region. The domestic pressure now on the leadership of Israel. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. Now, hundreds of thousands of Israelis have rallied amid a nationwide strike demanding an end to the war in Gaza and a deal with Hamas to release the remaining hostages. Organisers of the biggest protest in Tel Aviv say 500,000 people gathered in what's known now as Hostage Square. Let's go to Jerusalem now and speak to Bloomberg's Dan Williams. Dan, tell us more about the protests, what is driving them, what's motivating them, and what the response has been from the Israeli government.
Indeed, a very big protest, certainly by Israeli standards. Keep in mind that this is a country of 10 million people, so mobilizing 300,000-400,000 of them, 500,000 according to organizers, is a very big deal. This should be as no surprise given that for months now, polls in Israel have shown that most of the country wants to see a negotiated end to this war, which would recover the remaining hostages held by Hamas, even if that means leaving Hamas intact, still standing and sticking by its guns. Now, this is in contrast to the government's aims of destroying Hamas, or at least dismantling it, removing it from power, removing its arsenal, removing its leadership from the Gaza Strip. As a function of this war, Netanyahu is determined to press the war until that is achieved. He has said that these protests, the rally we discussed was actually a culmination of these wildcat sit-down protests at several highway junctions that disrupted some traffic earlier during the day. He has said this effectively is a call for a capitulation to Hamas, which would endanger Israeli national security for the long-term future. So for now, he seems undeterred, but this really is a mass mobilization, a physical manifestation of what has been popular dissent for several months now.
Yeah, and at a time, of course, when the reporting suggests many of his own military leaders have suggested that now is the time to end that conflict, or at least pursuing their additional war aims, are not viable. And it's 10 days, Dan, since Israel announced it would seize Gaza City. What is the progress that Israel is making on that front?
Now, Gaza City, it sounds fairly grandiose, certainly by Middle Eastern standards, but the actual urban area where the Israelis say they plan to focus their attacks is something like 20 square kilometers. That's the size of a provincial town in Europe. It's actually the size of the main New Delhi airport, just to give a sense of perspective. Nonetheless, very congested, 1 million civilians that Israel wants to remove one way or another before it goes in with full force. However, it would appear that the Israelis are slow-tracking this plan. There's been a lot of talk about it, a lot of signaling in advance, and this would suggest that at least in part, this plan is meant to generate pressure on Hamas in the hope that Hamas will relent on its terms for a ceasefire, will agree to leave the Gaza Strip and step down consensually rather than see its holdouts in what is the de facto capital of the Gaza Strip stormed and crushed militarily when and if that operation gets off the ground.
OK, Dan Williams with that update from Jerusalem. Dan, thank you. There's a lot more coming up. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. Here's a superlative for you then. Chinese stocks getting back to a place they have not been at since 2015. So the Shanghai Composite, that benchmark, of course, closing in. If it closes today at this level, we'll be at the highest level in a decade, since August of 2015. You've seen a lot of money, of course, from domestic investors moving into the Shanghai Composite. Again, you have to go all the way back to 2015 to get to the same levels that we're seeing in the Shanghai Comp. A lot of domestic investors, the cash flow is there, the liquidity is there, and a lot of this on the back of that easing of tensions, of course, between Beijing and Washington since April. In fact, since April, the Shanghai Comp is up about 20%. So the rally is there, and there's been a rotation out of bonds as well. And many that we speak to on the ground in China suggest, in terms of investors, that there is further to go in terms of upside. Of course, that will be partly dependent on how those negotiations between China and the US continue to evolve. Let's flip the board and have a look at a very different story. This in the crypto space. We've seen, of course, that rally for Bitcoin. Is it starting to fade? There are some put options, pretty aggressive demand for put options with a strike price. September the 26th, strike price of around 95,000, suggesting that you could see a 20% drop in Bitcoin. Strong demand for these put options, according to the data out there. Year to date, of course, you've seen Bitcoin rally around 23, 24%. But is that story starting to fade? Again, there has been some moves into those options with a strike price September the 26th of 95,000. You're still a ways off, of course, from that record high that we crossed on August the 14th of 124,514. Let's flip the board and have a look at the betting odds in these markets around a potential ceasefire when it comes to Russia and Ukraine. And ultimately, those in the markets, those placing these odds or these bets, of course, on Polymarket, they're not convinced that we are close to a ceasefire. We have, of course, that crucial meeting later today in Washington, so we'll see how those odds evolve. But you can see that, in fact, the odds in terms of that potential ceasefire, they've ground lower on the back of that meeting, of course, on Friday. So the opening trade is up next. We can walk you through that issue, of course, the key geopolitical issue of the moment and what to expect. They're also going to be speaking, the team, to the Ukrainian ambassador to the EU. So that conversation is at 7:30 a.m. What are Ukrainians hoping to get out of this meeting with President Trump in the White House, with the backing, of course, of those European leaders? Is there anything they can concede to in terms of the territorial demands? And how much comfort are they taking from those apparent security guarantees? Plenty more coming up. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg.